I think it's really important for me to distinguish between safety and comfort, because the safety of intimacy and vulnerability isn't necessarily comfortable. And I think that's an important distinction to make, especially for anyone who might hear this conversation, who conflates those two words. Just because you're safe doesn't mean you're going to be comfortable. And just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean that you're not safe.
Hey, this is Adam Hofmann.
And Mitch Anthony.
And Reggie Marra, and you're listening to Expansive Intimacy with Jim Young.
Welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young, and I'm on a quest to help men like you and me discover how to apply intimacy to unlock new, expansive versions of success in your relationships, your work, and your life. With each episode, we'll take another deep dive into the Intimacy Toolkit to show you how you can enhance your emotional intelligence, leadership abilities, and relationship skills. So settle in and open up, because it's time to get intimate. Hello and welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young. Do you have a place in your life where you can just walk into it and know that you can be fully yourself? That you can share whatever's going on in your world, whether it's in your personal life, your romantic life, your work life, with your mental health, with money, you name it, and you're going to feel totally safe doing it. Maybe a little uncomfortable, but able to just say it anyway and know that people are going to be there to support you in ways that feel right. I'm really lucky to have multiple spaces in my life where I can do that, one of which is a men's group that I've referenced on a couple of other episodes. We call it the Men of Teal, and there are about 10 guys in the group at present. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by 3 members of that group, my friends Adam Hofmann, Mitch Anthony, and Reggie Marra. They are some of my favorite human beings. They're men who I've shared deep, intimate stories and challenges and celebrations with in my life, and I've been there for them. We do this once a month. It's a conversation that's been running for about 3 years now, and I hope it goes on for many, many more years. Today, I invited them in to do a panel episode just to get a little bit more perspective on their experience of it, and also maybe to give you all a little taste of what a group of men who come together regularly and create a safe space for all those kinds of conversations, what that can be like. So in the episode, you're going to hear a lot about how we operate, about how we set agreements, about what it means to us and what we're able to reveal and kind of get off of our chests. So I hope you enjoy these 3 brilliant men who are joining me today. Let's go ahead and welcome Adam, Mitch, and Reggie onto the show. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me, Adam and Mitch and Reggie. I have not done many panel episodes, but I got this idea that I wanted to have a group conversation with some members of my men's group, and I'm so excited to have you joining me on the show today. So thanks for taking up the invite.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
As you know, on the show, the first question that I always ask is the one scripted question, which is, how do you define intimacy? And we'll go in alphabetical first name order with this to make a little bit of order out of the chaos. So Adam, you get to go first. How do you define intimacy?
Oh man, such a deep word. I think that deep was the first word that came out for me, actually. But for me, it's connection, deep connection, vulnerability, sort of being able to show up as your full self. And when I think about intimacy, I think about it both in terms of being intimate with myself. Can I show up authentically and be honest? Can I show up and connect deeply, be intimate with others? And I think there's kind of some different spheres around that, but that's what came up for me immediately.
So Mitch, pass it to you.
I'll build on that. Jim, you asked us this via email prior to this session, and what came up for me immediately is openness, transparency, and vulnerability. So Adam, I think you and I are riffing on the same themes. When I am honest with myself, I can be intimate with myself. When I'm honest with others, I can be intimate with them. And this is one of the things that I just cherish about our men's group, because we have built a community of trust and space where we can be open, honest, and transparent with each other.
And I'll jump in. I think my view of intimacy is consistent with Adam's and Mitch's, but I want to get really textured or granular in one way. So with myself and with people that I know, intimacy is that quality that allows and invites complete openness and vulnerability, and the guarantee that no one is leaving the room amid that openness and transparency. But expanding it out a little bit further, for me, intimacy is tied in with empathy and compassion, where my heart can be broken by people that I don't know, whether they're in Ukraine or Gaza or in Brooklyn, New York. And it doesn't really matter where they are, because of that species level intimacy that I know we're the same at that deep level.
And I want to add something, because it came up as soon as you said heart, Reggie, and that is, there's sometimes for me, it's hard to communicate what a definition for intimacy, because for me, it's so much more of a feeling. Like, and I feel like it's this warmth, it feels safe, I feel open, but like, it's this just right in the core of me that when true intimacy exists there, it's a feeling, it's a vibe, you know?
And Mitch, you raised the specter of how we've created some of these conditions in our men's group, which we affectionately know as the Men of Teal, in case we reference that throughout the episode. And I have my own sense of the ways in which we've done that. I think early on, some of the first sessions, we had some real intentional conversations about how to create the space. And I can't necessarily remember the details that we talked about there, but I have my own sense of how we do it on a month-by-month basis whenever we get together. I just love to have each of you, or whoever wants to share anything about, how do you see us as a group creating that space where we can do all the things that we do? I mean, we talk about some really vulnerable shit. We get all the way down to the nitty-gritty. How do we do it in your perspective?
I can build on that immediately, because I'll remind us that when we first came together, we acknowledged that we are a room of facilitators. We all know how to hold a room. So leadership, while we did assign it initially, it became very flat immediately, dissipated. Mm-hmm. And while we did early on utilize some very specific processes for considering, do you have, Mitch, a issue that you would like to bring to the room today? And we would follow some very specific guidelines for processing that within our agreed upon time. Pretty quickly, because we did recognize that we did not have to take responsibility for the leadership. It was going to be shared very organically. We began quite naturally, starting with a check-in, typically motivated by a meditation, a moment of silence together. And since that time, my experience is that the conversation leads from there. And I'll remind all of us that when we first started, we had agreed on once a month we would meet for 90 minutes. Recently, we've expanded that to 120, just because we did not have enough time to hold everything that was coming up.
Yeah, I think another important piece for me, that check-in always sets the tone, and somebody usually will open way up. I think because there's that psychological safety that exists in the group, and what you say in the group stays in the group. And I think on top of that is we've been really intentional about, we're not here to solve each other's problems, and which is a tough thing to do with a group of guys. I'm sure, at least for me, I'm like, oh, well, he should do this and he should try that. And it's a good exercise that you're not coming in thinking that you're going to share something and a bunch of people are going to try to tell you what to go and do. And I think, at least for me, that's helped me share more stuff, because I know that instead I'm going to get deep questions. I'm going to get curiosity. I'm going to get that empathy. And I don't need to have answers. I can just share what's going on. And that has really helped for me make the space feel that much safer to share inside of.
And I'm going to actually be intimate in my response, or at least try to. We'll see how it comes out. So one of the things that I bump into is I often have a conflict at the time we meet on Mondays, with a standing meeting that takes place on Mondays for me as well. And even when I don't have that conflict, when I'm in the middle of writing, I look at the Men of Teal schedule coming up, and I say, oh man, I just want to keep writing. I don't want to get on that call. And I always do, unless I have that conflicted meeting, which I have a kind of fiduciary responsibility for or towards. And I'm always glad that I did. So in terms of how we do this, there's always more benefit by engaging it than there is risk in not engaging it for me. Like, even though there's times when I want to just keep doing what I was doing. So I think in some ways that's a compliment to all of us, probably least so to myself, but yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I have looked at the meeting and been like, oh, it's an hour and a half. Like, I could get this other stuff done. And there's always this little tug. It's like, no, just show up. And a lot of times it's like, it's coming from a selfish place. If I'm gonna like a self label here, it's like, I have other stuff to do. Like, I'm good. I don't need help from the guys. And man, every time I show up with that mindset, I'm like, oh boy, did I need that today. which is so awesome. So awesome.
I'm going to add on to that, Adam, is that I've had that exact same experience of looking at the calendar and thinking, oh my God, I got so much to do. I can't spend my time on this. And it's not about like, I don't want to bring, I was like, I don't have the energy to help you guys today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to listen to your stuff. I got stuff going on here. And then I jump onto the call, that, little seed of resentment shrivels up, and I'm in it. There's a quote that I read years and years ago that you reminded me of, Reggie, and it's by Hazrat Inayat Khan. He's a Eastern mystic from, I think, maybe the 15th century or something. And it goes something like, God breaks the heart again and again and again until it remains open. And I think one of the reasons I show up when I make that commitment is because I'm going to witness heartbreak, either mine or somebody else's. And then I'm going to see the opening of that, where a light starts to shine in and out. And I don't have a question there, I don't think. I'm just curious, maybe to understand, what experiences have you guys had in our group that have maybe caught you off guard, like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen, and I don't know whether it's a specific story or just a general sense. What do these kind of groups open up for us?
Jim, one of the things that's occurred to me as we've gotten to know each other is, and it comes back to safety, and it comes back to no agenda. Sometimes someone will need some support, and it comes up early in the gathering that, hey, this guy needs some help today, and we end up giving most of our time to that person. But one of the things that strikes me is I never feel like it's charitable in any way, because I always get the reward back to the word of intimacy. I get the reward of intimacy by being there for that person that day. And for me, it ends up, I never, ever, it's never even occurred to me to keep a balance of who has needed extra, because it's not extra. My wife talks about raising our daughter, who's now 29 years old, and people will say, wow, it's such a sacrifice raising kids. And we always say, no, it's not a sacrifice. You put it out and it's endlessly rewarding. And I get the same feeling from our sharing.
Yeah, I love that, Mitch. And what I wanted, I don't know if I'm really adding to it or just putting something parallel to it. That not that by no means are we in any way identical. Well, 10 or 11 of us that participate. But we're men. We have a decent age range. And inevitably we experience many of the same experiences as men in the United States. And it's a matter of timing, for me, frequency, duration, and intensity. But whoever needs the help today, I've been there, or I'm going to be there. And I'm pretty sure that, again, without risking too much projection, that most of us have that same experience, again, with various degrees of timing, frequency, duration, and intensity. So that's just present. And I think that's part of the intimacy, because, oh yeah, I know what that feels like, my own version of it. So,
yeah. I think some of the more unexpected stuff that's come up for me over the year, I don't know, however long it's been a minute.
Like 2 or 3 years almost.
Yeah. Wild. Is the importance of that unstructured and open space that still has a little bit of a purpose, right? I find myself so often thinking that, well, if I'm not doing something, if I'm not making something or responding to emails, or I'm on a call, like what am I doing? But it's like, it's in that open space, even though we have a group and it's formalized, it's still relatively open. There's no agenda. There's so much magic that really comes out of that, and been trying to apply that to other areas for me as well. It's also helped me learn that my personal experience, just sharing what's been true for me, can help other people. And it sort of really reinforces the idea that, the best way to change the world is to kind of work on yourself and change yourself. And then be able to share that if so inclined. The other thing is that it's really forced me to confront my own shit by listening to everybody else. You hear somebody else tell a story and you're like, oh yeah, no, that's me. That's happening to me over here. Oh shoot. Those are the times when you're like, oh no, I feel pretty good. And you show up on that thing and you're like, oh wait, somebody gives language to something that you've been wrestling with, you've been trying to unpack somewhere else. And for me lately, it's been, I've come in full on facing my imposter syndrome. That's always been there, and I think it's always going to be there. So my quest for this year, though, is to how can I transform that imposter syndrome to something that's more of an ally as opposed to an enemy for me. Because every time I show up, you guys are so impressive, and you've got lots more wisdom than I do. And every time I show up, I'm like, who am I? Like, how can I help these guys? Like, I'm just some dude hanging out over here trying to figure it out. And then I, every now and again get lucky and say something insightful or share a story that helps somebody else out. I'm like, okay, I guess maybe I kind of got this,
You're invoking what Mitch was talking about. It's, honesty. It's like, just bare the chest. It's like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's real. And, Adam, despite the fact that you're the baby of the group, I believe by age, you
I'm
bring
the true
plenty
boy
of
of
wisdom.
Teal.
You're the boy of Teal. That first word, right? Men. And I think, Reggie, you were just talking about, we're all men. We're all men in a certain context. And Adam, I first met you around the subject of men's mental health. And it's something I always like to talk about, because I think it's one of those subjects that turns into taboo in certain circles, kind of a mainstream, male archetypes of the American man. Like, we're not supposed to have weakness. Mental health is not something that we need to deal with. And I think I'm trying to think of if there's somebody in our group who has not at some point brought forward on at least one occasion struggles with mental health. And, you know, how have you come to that? How does this group support you with just the honesty of the fact that things get difficult inside our heads?
I mean, I think you nailed it, right? It's the fact that it's this shared experience, and it's, as men, we can much more easily talk about some physical pain that we're having, but I would say more often than not, what I experience on a day-to-day basis is what's going on in between, you know, these two ears here. Like, most of our pain and frustration on a regular basis is something mental, if you will, or at least psychological, or it's the chatter in our head, or whatever it is. And so what I've learned over the years is, like, you kind of can't escape it. It's part of being a human. And it's more about how can you make that voice, how can you make your stories, how can you make that stuff sort of work for you. And there's also learning from you guys, like, so many different modalities to go through to explore this. Like, meditation isn't your bag, that's cool. How about working out? Like, that counts as mental health work too. Like, sure, you're lifting weights or doing whatever you're doing, but like, that helps you up here. There's the spiritual stuff. And so I think being open to more than just, I got to go see a therapist or I have to talk to a counselor and something's bad. Like, frankly, it's just been so helpful to have all that normalized as part of the crew.
I'll remind all of you that a year ago, I told the group that I was coming to grips with the fact that I, during the pandemic, had started to drink way too much. I was accepting an addiction, and I then joined AA, something that I'm very, very proud to say. I am a very proud member of AA. But I want to come back to the word safety. I had no hesitation sharing with you. In fact, it would have felt so strange to go through what some would consider a mental health crisis. To me, it was just a turning point. But it felt so wonderful and natural to be able to just on a Monday say, hey, by the way, you guys, I'm now announcing that I'm an alcoholic, and this is not a dry January. This is going to be a dry life from now on. And I want to come back to your word, Adam, normalized. It's become a normal understanding of our understanding of each other. And because I felt such safety, it didn't get blown out of any proportion. You know, for me, it's quite normal today. I go to AA every day, and I go to AA every day for the very same reason I come to the men's group. It's openness, it's trusting, it's transparent, it's vulnerable.
Mitch, I really appreciate you being vulnerable in this forum, because it's been one of the more powerful stories for me. I have my own history of working in 12-step programs, in the Al-Anon program, have had many alcoholic relationships in my life. And this is a Men of Teal podcast episode. It's not a Men of Teal meeting. I would never bring that subject onto the table, because that is for you to share. And I think the vulnerability of being able to say, you know, I feel safe in myself. I feel supported by my communities, allows us to be these beacons. And that's truly how I see you, Mitch, as a beacon of recovery and of hope and of healing. And so I just want to, you know, thank you for your willingness, both today, but also in our group, to really month over month explain like what you're discovering through your spiritual growth in AA and the lessons that it brings. Because I know I'm learning from it every time that you talk about it.
Well, I'll just say again, something you've heard me say very, very often. I wish the whole world had AA.
Yeah.
I sit with 30 people every day, and every day I cry with them. And they are so, to your point, Reggie, they are so different than me. I would never know these people in any other guise, and we trust each other. And every day I hear someone say, I don't know what's going on here, but it's magic. This is a miracle, and it is. And it's the miracle of trust. It's the miracle of listening. It's the miracle of being there for each other. which comes back to intimacy.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mitch. And I just, something has been coming up around the safety that we've been speaking about in the context of intimacy. And so I'm assuming that this is true for all of us. So I'm projecting again, but I think it's really important for me to distinguish between safety and comfort, because the safety of intimacy and vulnerability isn't necessarily comfortable. And I think that's an important distinction to make, especially for anyone who might hear this conversation, who conflates those two words. Just because you're safe doesn't mean you're going to be comfortable. And just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean that you're not safe. So I think, that's important. I mean, that comes out of coaching, it comes out of teaching, it comes from a lot of places. It comes from the voices in my head.
That's such a beautiful distinction, because I'm sitting here and there's a recent experience that I if this was a true men of Teal, I would be sharing openly, but I have tremendous amounts of discomfort thinking about sharing it, given that it does involve my wife, and I don't know how okay she would be with me sharing a conversation that we had over break. But I wanted to share that part of it because I think that that's such a good example based on what Reggie just said, where it has now got to the point inside of the Men of Teal where it feels unnatural to not share that kind of stuff, right? Where it's like, it would be painful for me to hold on to that inside of the group. And it is so refreshing and comfortable knowing that it has a place to come out. But at the beginning, that wasn't true. The beginning, it wasn't true at all. I had a long list of things every single meeting where I was like, oh, I want to share this and I want to share this. But I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready to. So it's not to say that, you go and you set up a group and you follow all the best practices and boom, immediately it's there. It has to, for me, I had to sort of grow into that. But now it's the opposite. It would be so weird for me to not share these things with the group, and instead to kind of hold them to myself.
I think what you said earlier, Adam, about there's no need or even desire, I think at this point in the group, for people to come with solutions when somebody shares something, that nobody's trying to fix anybody else, that trust has built up for me over time, that I know that I can share something and there's not going to be judgment. Because I think when we start with good intentions to say, hey, I have an idea for you, I think there's judgment sitting behind that. And I think it's so hard to know any kind of advice to give to any other person, given the totality of their experience. And so to just be listened to, and as you said, Reggie, like the empathy and the compassion that comes towards me when I'm the one who's sharing something vulnerable is all I need pretty much every time. And Mitch, I saw you on camera walk over to your bookcase and pull something out. So I have a sense that you've got something to share.
Well, it just strikes me that we are very casually referring to Teal, and it occurs to me that someone listening to this might not understand what we mean. When we say Teal, we are referring to a book called Reinventing Organizations, a guide to creating organizations inspired by the next stage of human consciousness. And Teal is a classification given to discovering more soulful, more meaningful ways to work together, including changing our belief systems. So we came together around an agreement that we wanted to learn to do that in our work. It's very interesting to me that we do talk about our work, but it's almost never about our organization. Sometimes it is, but more often than not, it's about our own role in the world, including our work. In that same context of how we came together and what was the understanding, Jim, I want to give you credit for being the instigator of this group. It was your invitation to me to join this group. And I have to admit that when I was told I was being asked to join a men's group, I did get a little triggered because I thought, well, I consider myself a feminist. I'm aware of patriarchy. I'm aware of my privilege. I do strive to be open. I don't need to be convinced that traditional men's behavior is limiting. And then when we got together, I realized, oh, we're all in that place. We don't need to be. In fact, I'll remind all of you that I wrote in my own newsletter recently about the concept of women's circles. And I sent out a note to the group saying, I think we're a women's circle. Can I refer to us as that? And without hesitation, everyone said, oh, there's no question we are a women's circle. So not only are we teal, but we're very, very feminist in principle. I do think it helps that we are just men, because I do think we have some privilege that needs to be acknowledged, and we do have some role in perpetuating the patriarchy.
I see us as humanist, because I think we are looking at the feminist perspective, but we're also looking at evolving ways of masculinity. That how can we be together? How can we use that privilege that we've been granted just by our birthright of the shells we were born into in ways that are positive and constructive? Reggie, I'm kind of looking at you because I see your wheels turning, I think, but I also know that you're probably one of the more studied members of our group when it comes to things like teal and spiral dynamics and that. So I'm just wondering what thoughts are bubbling up for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, the book that Mitch was referring to is Frederick Laloux's Reinventing Organizations. I'm pretty sure that's the one you took from the shelf. I saw like the leaves on it or something. So I was impressed too that I like watching someone walk to their bookshelf, reach for a book, they know exactly where that book is. So I admire that you did that, Mitch. But more specifically, that language that Laloux uses comes specifically from Ken Wilber's work. And teal, as Wilber used it, is the first of the developmental perspectives that was able to look at earlier developmental perspectives. Again, not lesser or worse than, but teal is a later perspective that you have to grow through. And teal was the first one that could look, and it's known as an integral perspective, that could look back at postmodernism, modernism, traditionalism, and pre-traditional perspectives and understand each of them and see their value. Postmodernism, modernism, traditionalism, and earlier perspectives saw the others as wrong, evil, stupid, or bad. And the teal perspective, as Wilber used it, is that first one that could see that says, oh, I got here because I'm able to see these others and understand them, and I don't have to judge them. Now, they're not all equal by any stage of the imagination, but they can all be healthy. So that's my take. In fact, we even had I think a session or two where I had written a long email early on saying, okay, here's my understanding of teal. And that is simply because I wanted to be clear on what I was getting myself into. But thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to proselytize like that.
Well, thanks for never making me feel wrong, stupid, or bad.
Well, it's been an effort, but it's
I know you work hard at it. I appreciate that. I wanted to, as we were talking, I just had this thought, like I've known each of you for about 3 years, and I want to give credit to Ed Fraunheim, another member of the group, for co-founding this group with me. It was the two of us who concocted the idea and reached out to various people, and we've had most of us together for about 3 years, some people in, some people out. And I was thinking, I didn't know you. Actually, Mitch, I met you maybe 5 years ago at a workshop that you were facilitating, but didn't really get to know you. I just got to see you in action, and I was impressed enough to invite you, or to find other connections with you. But I don't know you from the before days, right? So I'm thinking about my before times of when I would willingly take 90 or 120 minutes once a month to show up on a Zoom call, just another Zoom call, with a bunch of guys from all over the place who I don't really know all that well. And why would I do that? And what was I like back then? So I just want to open up a little bit of a portal into the who you used to be that wanted eventually to find his way into these kinds of conversation circles?
I'll take that first. I'll say for myself that I didn't consciously avoid them. I just didn't know that they existed. And I don't think that it was until, so my before person still is the today person. Like, I've always been interested in how people work, how we operate, why are we the way that we are. Always been fascinated by people, but it wasn't until I was going through my own stuff, got diagnosed with depression, anxiety, started taking medication, seeing a therapist, that I got to do my own unpacking and sort of see the work in progress. And what happened for me was, it felt normal to me coming out of my sessions with my therapist to share those aha moments with my friends. And I kept having men in particular. If I shared it with women, they'd just open right up and we'd chit chat about everything. If I shared it with guys, eventually, after we talked through all the surface level stuff, they'd be like, hey, remember when you were talking about that thing you talked about with your therapist? Like, I'm dealing with that too. Like, what do I do? And so I started thinking, like, why aren't more men talking about this? Which led me to do the Mandate Project, which led me to get to know you. And at that point in time, I was craving, like, why are there not more groups of guys who are talking about this? So that's how I got introduced to men's group. And frankly, I'm grateful that I found Men of Teal as my first men's group, really, that I was a part of, because there's a lot of different flavors of them. And I think that that's sort of part of the journey, is figuring out which flavor is right for you. But like, I mean, I think everybody needs it at this point in time. That's the today version of me speaking.
I'll jump into that. Back in my 30s and in my early 40s, I didn't understand the concept of men's groups, because I was arrogant enough to think, and this is, I'm not projecting the arrogant part on this to you, Mitch, but I was living in a world that, both where I worked as an educator and in my relationships, I was living in a world with men and women, and I understood them. And I don't know if I was really a feminist back then, but I believed in equal rights for women. I didn't understand why men would, what was the value of just getting men together, because that's unnatural. That's me thinking younger. But there's a group of guys that I've been, sitting with once a month in person in Connecticut since 2001. And I knew one of them for some years prior to that, and he was always referring to his monthly meetings. And I was never curious at first, and then I was always, I wanted to know what was going on. So that New Year's Eve, I think 2001, he said, I'm talking to some of these guys, and I think you would be a good fit for us. Would you consider joining it? And I said, let me talk to my attorney. But I went, and I'm forever grateful that I did, because I'm in the group now for about 22 years, and they've been meeting for some of them over 30 together. And it's just the level of conversation you're allowed to have first as men. And I'm sure, again, women's circle can do the same thing with none of us present. That it's this safe space to share, and no one is leaving the room. And we've worked with each other through divorces, deaths of parents, serious illnesses. One just had a lung transplant in early 2023. He's doing phenomenally well now. So it's I didn't understand the value of it due to my own arrogance or ignorance, or both. And I had to kind of grow into the opportunity to accept it when it was offered to me.
You're bringing that up, Jim, reminds me that prior to the pandemic, any and all groups I was a member of were physical. We got together in the same room. And I don't have to remind anyone here that we are across 3 time zones, our group. And I've long had online connections with people I've met, typically online, and then we've gotten to know each other first on the phone and then online. But it wasn't until the pandemic that I began to participate in regular hangouts on Zoom. And I'll remind you, Jim, that prior to this group, Liz Solomon and I facilitated or invited a book group to come together online in Zoom. And that was co-ed, and that was very, very similar to this group. And we first read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, and then we went on and we read Laroux's book. So that had preceded, when you asked me, that you were essentially asking me to join a second group, and we had a little bit of a precedent for it.
You might have been an inspiration, Mitch.
Well, that's what's wonderful, is we're all inspiring to each other.
Yeah.
This is the thing about cool ideas, is that in the right group, you forget who had them. All you know is it came up.
Yeah, that's right. When you said, like, Jim, you formed the group, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know if I actually did. I was just, channeling something and relaying it. And you were one of those links in the chain, that those book groups, that was early pandemic.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a lifeline for me to be in conversation about things that were bigger and hopeful, as opposed to bigger and, seemingly catastrophic. And it really was a wonderful balance, and some amazing people that we got to meet, and the same kind of conditions, where in a co-ed group, because this is a distinction that's come up a couple of times, is that, this is we have a men's group, and we can have these connections with anybody and everybody. We can create the same kind of conversations and the same sort of safety. And, to the point you made earlier, Reggie, that safety and comfort are not equivalent.
Right.
And in fact, the thing I love the most about our conversations is that I can expect to get uncomfortable, whether it's I'm moved to share something that feels like I haven't shared this with anybody, or certainly, maybe not other guys, or I'm uncomfortable with something that Adam is sharing, and I'm like, oh my God, that would feel really hard for me, or I don't know what to say to him. And as you said, Reggie, nobody leaves. You said that a couple of times, and it struck me the first time you said it, and I was kind of wondering what you meant. And then when you repeated it a moment ago, I got it. I was like, oh, right. It's the commitment, not just my commitment to show up for myself once a month, but my commitment to show up and be there and stay there for no matter what happens, and witness and hold the space, and not have to do anything to tell anybody what they ought to do. It is magic.
And just for anybody listening, that not leaving is metaphorical, because occasionally we have commitments and some of us leave half an hour early for the meetings. But in other words, no one's going to book out because they're uncomfortable, is what we're saying there. So,
yeah. We've got just a few minutes left. Reggie, one of the things that I wanted to get to is the connection between what we've been talking about, these kinds of spaces like the Men of Teal group, as we call it, and how they might connect to what you wrote about in Healing America's Narratives. Reggie's an author many times over, and his recent book really talks a lot about our individual and collective shadows, and the things that kind of lurk in the dark, if you will, that are part of all of the kind of stress and difficult conditions in the world that we have. And I just wonder, is there a connection that you see to the kind of conversations, the kind of work that we do in this small group of men once a month, and that bigger palette that you've painted?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is on a variety of levels. I'm going to just try to be really concise to kind of zero in and not try to cover all 525 pages. So the subtitle of the book is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And I get into all of that language. But more specifically to your question, Jim, is this idea of intimacy, the intimacy that we share. And again, over your right shoulder is your own book, Expansive Intimacy. And so it's really what we're talking about in terms of men and masculinity. But in terms of healing America's narratives, historically, the initial subjugations of women, indigenous peoples, and Africans, and subsequently African Americans, through other subjugations, and currently through attempts to limit who can vote and who can't vote in terms of American citizens. What's lacking there, and this is an oversimplification, and I believe it's accurate, what's lacking there is a deep, honest sense of intimacy, and complemented with empathy and compassion. Oh, that's another human being just like me. Our founders, who gave us this great document, didn't see women, indigenous peoples, or Africans as being just like them, and denied them that phrase of being created equal. And various iterations of that have continued and continued to today. So these kinds of gatherings, as we have in our Men of Teal, and in what a group like Braver Angels is doing on a different level, at a different scale, getting political opponents into civil conversations and debates, that allows for the intimacy to at least begin. I don't want to say trickle down. It allows us to put our toes into intimacy at a very, very low level. So absent intimacy, I don't think there can be any real healing.
You remind me of a famous quote by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think part of why I want to keep talking about intimacy in even these small groups, whether it's a one-to-one podcast, a 4-person panel, our monthly 9 or 10 person call, is that I truly have this belief that if we keep doing that, if more of us keep doing that, then we change the world. We heal all of those divisions that we can't get across if we're not being intimate, if we're trying to be safe but not uncomfortable. I would just want to thank you all, just like deeply from my heart, for being friends of mine and for being people who care about these conversations, and for showing up today, as you always do, with the wisdom that you have, even if you're a boy of Teal, Adam, and for being vulnerable and open and sharing your stories. So thank you so much for coming on the show, continuing the conversation, hopefully spreading a little bit more expansive intimacy.
Thanks for having
us.
It's such a privilege.
All right, thank you for joining in for another episode of this long-running conversation where we're exploring how intimacy can affect our lives in all sorts of positive ways, whether in our personal relationships, at work, with our friendships, and our parenting, and beyond. And with all that in mind, I have 2 questions for you before we wrap up. First, what's one thing you heard on today's episode that could help you start to expand the intimacy in your life? Either some kind of discovery you might do internally, or some step you might take towards another person. Second, who's somebody that you thought of during today's episode, somebody who popped into your mind that maybe could benefit from hearing this conversation as well? Would you consider sharing the episode with them right now? Be a fantastic way to continue expanding intimacy to even more people. Lastly, I have a bunch of other resources available for folks who want to continue exploring intimacy, starting with my book, Expansive Intimacy: How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout. I have a bunch of other resources that I'd be happy to share with folks. Just reach out to me, jim@thecenteredcoach.com, and I'd be happy to help you on that path as well. I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of Expansive Intimacy.